So good evening. My name is Francis Negro Montaner. I'm a professor in the Department of English and Comparative Literature and the director for the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race, which we call CSER for short. And CSER is Columbia's main hub for the research, teaching, and public programming about ethnicity, race, and indigeneity, among other things. How I came to have the honor to introduce today's event is that CSER has a biennial program called Artists at the Center. And basically what we try to do with this program is that we invite what we consider legendary artists whose work critically and creatively engages with race and ethnicity as topics or practices to engage in conversation and consider and show us different worlds that we can live in. When the time came to think about this year's program, I made a very, very short list of my dream guests. And then I asked a few friends to do the same. And when I looked at all the lists, I noticed something very striking, which that they all had David Henry Hwang at the top of the list, literally. So having no doubts as to who I should invite, I started mentioning to some colleagues, and one of the first was theater scholar Jean Howard, who is sitting here, who thought the idea was, to quote her, fabulous. Then I mentioned it to Eileen Viluli, Associate Director of the Heyman Center, and she said, it's a fantastic idea, but we already invited him. With the School of the Arts public program. I'm like, oh my gosh, crisis. But at that point, collaborative beings that we are, we decided to come together to present tonight's event as both part of the Heyman Center's The Writing Lives and CSER's Artists at the Center series. In bringing the two centers together, what we hope to accomplish, because we probably come at these themes a little from different places, was to offer an exciting and interesting ways of thinking about David Henry Hwang's work, raising questions about his unique career arc, writing habits, themes, and future plans. Tonight, I hope that we explore everything from how does Asian American identity and experience play out at home and abroad, with the very terms of home and abroad critically in flux, to the role of music and love in his creative imagination, and his future plans to do a project on Bruce Lee. And I actually stayed home yesterday up a little bit, listening to Bruce Lee, and I can see that there's just an amazing work that can come out of that. In some, we are all likely all here because we know something about David Henry Hwang or because we want to know more about him. And for those of you who wonder out of random curiosity, I will say a few orienting words about Mr. Hwang. He's been called the first important dramatist of American public life since Arthur Miller. Perhaps best known for M. Butterfly, Hwang's plays include The Dance and the Railroad, Golden Child, Yellow Face, and Family Devotions. Among his many accolades, Hwang has received Tony Awards, Drama Desk Awards, Grammy Awards, Obie Awards, and has been a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize. His work spans a wide range, from the Broadway and off-Broadway stage to television, film, and opera, including 4 operas with composer Philip Glass. In 2011, Hwang's play Chinglish was named Best New American Play by Time magazine. In 2012, he received the prestigious Steinberg Award, the William Inch Award for Distinguished Achievement in the American Theater, and the Asia Society Cultural Achievement Award. He's currently working on a movie adaptation of Chinglish and a new play inspired by the life of Bruce Lee called Kung Fu, which will premiere this fall at the Signature Theater Company. Leading our dialogue tonight are two very different yet equally compelling thinkers about the theater. Professor Jean Howard is the George Delacorte Professor in the Humanities at Columbia, specializes in Shakespeare, Tudor and Stuart drama, early modern poetry, modern drama, feminist and Marxist theory, and the history of feminism. Professor Howard has received Guggenheim, NEH, Mellon, Folger, Huntington, and Newbery Library Fellowship, and has won several teaching awards. Her book, Theatre of a City, The Places of London Comedy, 1598-1642, won the 2008 Barnard Hewitt Award for Outstanding Theatre History. In 2012, she published a monograph on Shakespeare and Marx with Krzysztof Bartolowicz. Her forthcoming book, entitled Staging History, looks at Shakespeare's history plays as a way of probing the political issues raised in the work of Tony Kushner and Carol Churchill. Professor Gregory Mosher has directed and produced nearly 200 stage productions at the Lincoln Center and Goodman Theaters, both of which he led, on and off Broadway, at the Royal National Theatre and in London's West End. Mosher has produced or directed new work by artists such as Samuel Beckett, Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller, Leonard Bernstein, Jerome Robbins, Ellen May, Spalding Gray, and Nobel Prize winners Wole Soyinka and Derek Walcott. Mosher's most enduring collaboration was with David Mamet, with whom he worked for over 20 years and premiered 23 plays and adaptations. He teaches at Columbia School of the Arts and launched the university's art initiative in 2004. Mosher has received every major American theater award, including 2 Tonys, and was nominated for a Tony Award in 2010 for his direction of Arthur Miller's A View from the Bridge. Welcome, Mr. Hwang, to Columbia, and welcome everybody to tonight's conversation.
I'll go. We thought, Jane and I, we haven't consulted anyone else. It would be interesting to know sort of what brought you here and your level of Hwangicity. So I'm curious, how many of you would, just raise your hands, describe yourself as aficionados of this writer's work? Anybody who feels they've just, like, I have all his records. And how many of you have seen or read, and I'm hoping there will be a lot of people who actually meet David tonight. That would be great. And how many of you have seen or read some sort of moderate amount of it? And how many of you are virtual newbies? Don't be embarrassed. I would be great. Okay, good. So now we are. Jean, go.
All right, good.
You're on.
Can you hear me out of this? Okay, good. David, I know you probably get asked this all the time, but I'm going to ask it first off. Do you ever chafe at being called an Asian American dramatist? Do you ever just want to be David Hwang dramatist?
Well, I've gone back and forth on that question at various points in my career. There's some times when I've really embraced the label, and there's other times when I've sort of run away from it. I mean, at the moment, I kind of feel 2 things. Number one, that it is literally true. I am Asian American, and I am a playwright. And, you know, and actually, I write about these subjects a fair amount so that it's not unfair to put that label on me. But number 2, you know, I kind of have started to feel like everybody gets labeled one way or another. Like, I mean, if you're lucky enough to have any degree of sort of notoriety, that's just the way our culture works. And so people may not get labeled according to their ethnicity, but, you know, like David Mamet is a good example. Like, people think, okay, a Mamet play is like a bunch of guys and a lot of testosterone and a lot of F-bombs. And, you know, that's the range of his work is actually much larger than that. But that's what he gets associated with. So, and to go a step further, I've actually started to feel in recent years that if they can't label you, it's kind of a detriment to your career. Because a lot of critics are sort of lazy. And if they feel like they can put a label on you, and, you know, like Kushner is sort of the gay socialist writer, and then, you know, you get written about more. So all in all, then I've decided it's okay.
You're probably the play that everybody knows you most for is M. Butterfly. And when that came out, it raised a firestorm of both praise and critique. Queer scholars had things to say, Asian Americanists, feminists, everybody. Looking back at it now, why do you think it was so explosive culturally?
I mean, it did sort of push a lot of hot topic buttons. And I think that was both the reason for its success, and also, you know, for everything has its pluses and minuses. Everything has its advantages and disadvantages. And so the flip side of that is it also pissed off a lot of people. And it could be critiqued either positively or negatively from various Asian American feminist or queer standpoints. And that, I guess, I basically feel good about that, because I feel like, what do we do as artists if we're not trying to create things that people talk about and people have strong feelings about? And sometimes those are going to be negative feelings, although with them, Butterfly, I would say that primarily it was a pretty positive reception.
And what, looking back now, were you trying to do politically with that play at that moment when it was produced? What were the questions you hoped it would raise, start a conversation about?
I mean, I think the questions are inherent in the setup of the play. And for those of you who don't know it, it's about it's based on the true story of a French diplomat who had a 20-year affair with a Chinese actress who turned out to be A, a spy, and B, a man in drag. And the diplomat claimed that he never knew that his lover was actually a man. So in trying to figure, I thought this was, well, that's really interesting. And I wanted to write a play about it and thought about it for a few months. And then at some point, I was driving around and I asked myself, what did the diplomat think that he'd found? And the answer came to me, he probably thought he'd found his version of Madame Butterfly, the heroine from Puccini's opera, who kind of became the template for the stereotype of the submissive Oriental woman who sacrifices herself for a white man throughout most of the 20th century. And so the conceit was that, at the beginning of the play, the Frenchman fantasizes that he's Pinkerton, the American lieutenant from the opera, and that by the end of the play, the Frenchman realizes, it's actually he who's Butterfly, and that it's he who was deceived by love, and the Chinese spy who perpetrated that deceit was therefore the real Pinkerton. So in that setup, you end up with a lot of kind of cultural and political questions. What is the nature of sexual identity? How do we perceive Asia from the West, and in particular Asian women? What is the nature of love versus self-delusion? So I think in these these various axes, it created a lot of opportunity to explore these different issues. So, but if you ask me, well, what did I try to do politically? I mean, the only thing I was conscious of was to kind of deconstruct the Madame Butterfly archetype. And then maybe as I started writing it, I began to discover this link between talking about race and talking about gender, and how power balances affect both and they're sort of ruled by similar impulses. But basically, I just thought this was a pretty interesting way to tell the story.
Puccini was really important in that play, and you've also you seem interested in particularly Chinese opera over and over again. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship to music in your work?
I think when I started writing, I was interested in a movement in the 1970s called theatricalism, where we're kind of trying to bring all the elements that you can do on stage into a play. So whether that involved dance or music, because I felt when I started to write, well, what does theater do better than other mediums? I mean, we were long into theater needing to compete with film and television as a naturalistic medium. But what theater could do better is, it's much more exciting to hear live music than to hear music on tape. It's much more exciting to see dance live. So how could we utilize these other aspects of theater to make our plays as exciting as possible? So there's that agenda. And then there's the other agenda of trying to, particularly in the early parts of my career, sort of consciously create a kind of Asian American aesthetic. The term Asian American was relatively new. Most people say it was invented in 1968 at the San Francisco State Students' Third World Strike. And then, so by the time we get to, I'm writing my first play, FOB, in 1978, so the term's only about 10 years old. And so there's this kind of very conscious attempt by Asian American artists of this time to create this new aesthetic. And because I've realized in retrospect that I'm a writer who's very interested in form, but I felt, okay, it's not just enough to have Asian American content. I want to figure out, well, what's an Asian American form? How do you change the form to express these things? And just the most immediate, the first idea that came to my head really was, to begin to incorporate kind of traditional Chinese theater forms into a sort of a Western naturalistic framework. And God knows I'm not the first person to do this. A lot of people have done it before me, and you can also look at, Sondheim and Weidman trying to bring in Japanese forms and Pacific overtures. But this seemed exciting to me. It wasn't a form that I grew up with. And then I had the good fortune of my first play, FOB, being done at the Public with an actor named John Lone, who many of you know because he went on to be the Emperor in The Last Emperor, Bertolucci's '88 film. But John grew up in the Cantonese opera in Hong Kong. So he was part of that last generation that also includes Jackie Chan and Sammo Hung, and who sort of grew up in the Cantonese opera when it was sort of horrible and Dickensian, and kids had to stand on one foot and with bricks in their hands for hours. But because he'd had that training, he was sort of my first teacher about opera, and over the years I've kind of come back to it because it is exciting to try to figure out how to utilize this form, and I know so little about it that I feel like through working with various practitioners I'm able to increase my knowledge.
If any of you get a chance to see The Dance in the Railroad signature, it has a stunning actor.
Thank you. We're really lucky.
Yeah, who does some of this.
Well, I mean, if I can just sort of comment on that. Dance in the Railroad. Do you want to get to it later?
Plug
okay.
it. No, plug it.
No, it's just that John Lone, then I wrote another play for him, The Dance in the Railroad, and the character, because I'm not particularly original, is called Lone. And I wrote it for him and an actor named Tai Ma, and his character is called Ma. And this was, it's about two Chinese-American railroad workers on the Transcontinental Railroad in America in 1867. And this was the play where I really tried to kind of consciously create a blend of Western naturalism and Chinese opera. And it doesn't get revived much. It ran for about 6 months at the Public in 1981 because it's so hard to cast. I mean, you kind of figure, well, you have to find this actor with this, very specific skill set, being able to do the movement, who has a background in opera, but can also is also kind of brilliant at acting in a Western naturalistic context. So when we decided to revive it at Signature, I felt like, okay, well, this production is going to rise and fall on whether we can cast it. And I feel like we were very lucky to find this guy, William Wu, who is a third-generation Chinese opera person who performed it in China, but then who came over here. He was in the ART program in Boston, and my director, Maya Dralas, found him, and he's worked out wonderfully. So I'm glad the production worked for you.
I have to say, I thought he was just thrilling. It was really good to watch. I'd like to shift gears a little bit. And Gregory, you ready to jump in yet?
You're so on it.
All right. I want to shift gears a little bit to the autobiographical elements in your work. Some of your plays, particularly Yellowface, and some others, obviously you're weaving fictionalized version of yourself, your father into these. Do you feel that you write somehow from a reservoir of autobiographical experience, memory?
I mean, I feel like it's hard for me to speak for other authors, but let me just try to make a blanket statement that all authors, I think, write somewhat from an autobiographical place, in that we are taking from our own experience, and because we have to find ways to relate to a story and feel a story and understand characters, and that usually means kind of fusing some aspect of the character with your own experience. So that said, what about works that are more explicitly autobiographical? It seems to me that if I look at even, great major classic American plays, people always have problems with the autobiographical characters. If you look at, say, Glass Menagerie, in some ways, Tom is a tougher character to try to bring to life. I would argue that even in Long Day's Journey into Night, which is almost, perfectly written, Jamie is maybe less well developed than the other three characters. So I think it's hard to write about oneself with any degree of objectivity, and to also give your own experience the sort of narrative arc that's necessary to propel a play, because you get too kind of tied into the truth of your life, and the truth of your life becomes the priority rather than sort of the mechanics of what a character needs to do to have a compelling narrative. So I wrote a few plays that were autobiographical in the sort of traditional sense, which I don't know that I actually think they're such great plays. And so I feel like I continued to work in that for a while. And by the time I got to Yellowface, which was just in 2007. And I decided to name a character after myself, just to call it to the lead character is an Asian American playwright named D.H.H. who wrote M. Butterfly. And suddenly I found that incredibly liberating. Like, it was once I named the character after myself, then I didn't feel compelled to tell the truth about him, which is kind of counterintuitive. But that was, I think, my most successful attempt to create an autobiographical character, and oddly enough, because I didn't hide the name, I was able to hide more of the facts of his life.
I want to ask you also about your next play, the Bruce Lee one, which we know nothing about. What's it going to be like, and when's it coming out? And
I had this idea in the mid-'90s to do a show about Bruce Lee. And I talked to Linda, Bruce's widow, and she was really into the idea. And at the time, I thought, okay, it was like I wanted to do a musical about Bruce Lee. And so then it took a few years to get the rights together, and then, I got a Broadway producer involved, and we sort of put a Broadway team together by the time you get to about 2002, 2003. And we worked on it for a few years, and I just couldn't get it right. So it all sort of fell apart. And then about 2 or 3 years ago, I had this idea of rebooting it, but not as a musical. Because, the problem is always when you try to make Bruce Lee sing, as I was saying earlier, it was very kind of South Park in not a good way. And so then I almost like Dance on the Railroad, really, the idea of doing a dancicle, a play that has a lot of movement, because it's got to have movement, because it's about a martial artist. And then you underscore that movement, but you don't actually have songs. And that was a big key to why I felt that I was able to write a successful first draft. And then the other thing, in terms of finding his voice, was that I gave myself permission in this recent iteration to write him with an accent, to write him as someone who doesn't have a good mastery of English. And I feel like when I started out, like 20 or 30 years ago, the whole thing about being an Asian American writer, and particularly an American born in ABC, is like, well, it's demeaning to write a character with an accent. And I feel like over the decades, I had to get over my own prejudice in that regard. And I had to realize, to some extent, the society has changed also, and the baggage of a Chinese accent is different now than it was 20 or 30 years ago. But I had to kind of overcome my own prejudice and go, I can write a character who's still struggling with English, and that character can be completely affirming and powerful and compelling and all those things. And I feel like once I gave myself permission to give Bruce Lee an accent, then, which really he of course did. He was a kind of a troublemaking kid from Hong Kong who came to the U.S. and never studied his English very hard in Hong Kong. And even when you get to the late movies, he's still struggling with pronunciation. So then all of a sudden he came to life. So it's a show that we did a workshop. The choreographer is a Shanghai-based choreographer named Hwang Dodo, who is certainly the most well-known choreographer in Shanghai and one of the most successful and well-known in China. And so we did a workshop, just a movement workshop with Dodo in Shanghai in November. And the composer is Wang Lihom, who is arguably the most successful Mandarin pop star in America today, in the world today. And if anyone saw Chinglish, we used Lihom music from his catalog for all the scene changes. But he's writing some new music for this. So it's an international collaboration, and we are doing 2 workshops of it here in New York in 2013. And actually, it's not going to open at Signature because it's a big show, and we just need time to work on all the details. We're not opening it until about a year from now. It goes into rehearsal January of 2014.
And you're also taking a play to China this summer, right? Is this did I read that somewhere?
Yeah, that hasn't been announced yet, but there's 2 shows I'm taking to I guess Hong Kong counts as China, although Hong Kongers don't necessarily think of themselves as mainlanders. But Chinglish is going to Hong Kong. So there's the Chinglish tour, which is currently in Southern California, which next Tuesday I'm going to Hong Kong, and they'll have arrived a couple days before me. But Dance on the Railroad, this production at Signature, has not been announced yet, but we are taking that to the Wucheng Festival, which is a new theater festival outside Shanghai in one of these canal towns. And it's curated by a Taiwanese playwright director named Stan Lai, or Lai Shengchuan. And Stan invited me to bring something over, and so and that'll be my first legitimate production in China. I mean, I've probably had some productions in China that were kind of under the radar, but M. Butterfly can't be done there, Chinglish can't be done there. So, but a play about two Chinese American railroad workers who are striking against evil white people can be done there.
Gregory?
So I want to read from the comments at the end of M. Butterfly, which I suppose you wrote 20 years ago. It says, can you hear me? M. Butterfly has sometimes been regarded as an anti-American play, a diatribe against the stereotyping of the East by the West, of women by men. Quite to the contrary, I consider it a plea to all sides to cut through our respective layers of cultural and sexual misperception, to deal with one another truthfully for our mutual good from the common and equal ground we share as human beings. So that's the setup. So I read Chinglish over the weekend, and forgive me, but I didn't see it. So I read it cold. And do you know this play?
Yes.
Yes, no, should you just explain the setup of Chinglish?
Okay, it's...
Or I will, if you want.
You can do it.
Well, Chinglish is the story. You correct me. Here's what I got.
Good.
An American has gone to do business in an American man whose marriage is falling apart and whose business life has fallen apart, comes to China to try to do business and meets a whole group of Chinese people, principally among them a Chinese woman who speaks a little Chinese.
A little English.
A little English, sorry. Whose marriage is likewise worthless and imprisoning. And as he is trapped in American capitalism, it happens to be Ayn Rand, but that doesn't matter, she's trapped in the party system. And these two people find each other, become lovers, and it doesn't end well for them.
That's fair enough.
Correct, right?
Yeah.
So I want to now put those two things together. I consider it a plea to all sides to cut through our respective layers of cultural and sexual misperception to deal with one another truthfully for our mutual good from the common and equal ground we share as human beings. And I started to think as I was rereading all these plays, it's this and then, oh, is that hard? Right? That would be a Hwangian theme, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
That somehow gender and culture and simple language. It's so I just thought, what a great metaphor for lovers, that you just can't understand what the other person is saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, in some, Chinglish is about various layers of misunderstanding, and perhaps a lot of my plays are. And the most superficial of those is language. But then there are various sort of cultural differences and predispositions and assumptions that are made because they're from different places. But go underneath that, and it's like, none of us speaks a language perfectly. And particularly when it comes to love, but also oftentimes in matters of business. You can be speaking with someone who the two of you have the same language and completely misunderstand each other. So, yes, that rather noble goal that I set out in the afterword to M. Butterfly is very hard to achieve, and I think most of the plays also involve what you lose along the way when you're trying to achieve that.
Yes, and it relates to this not constant but regular use of masks in your plays. That people dress as things and are very conscious about it. And watch, we were talking just before we started about this. There's a really beautiful play David's that I didn't know, and I'm just the House of Sleeping Beauties, which is, I believe, an adaptation of the
Kawabata novella.
Of the Kawabata novella, and it's stunning. I mean, it's just a great, great piece of theater, and it ends with her dressing in a costume and making up, and it's funny and it's beautiful. He says women don't like to have men watch them make up, and yet she achieves who she is really through that mask and.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a lot of changing faces in my, and that line about, there are often lines in the plays about some sort of face changing into another face. And so there is, on a larger thematic sense, there's one way in which the plays are about the fluidity of identity, how you can think you're one person and then you get put in a different context and you transform and you become someone else almost, and someone you may not even recognize. But then I think there's also this concern in the plays with that when you say they consciously put on masks, the roles that we play, what does it mean to take on an identity? Yeah. And I think in Yellowface even, it sort of ends up that the DHH character tells the audience that he feels he became just another actor running around in Yellowface. So even as an Asian person, you can play your ethnicity. You can assume the role of your of what it is that you look like, and that can be a role. That isn't necessarily true. So the plays are a lot about that relationship between what the identity you choose, the face you choose to wear, and the relationship between that mask and who you are.
I know you want to segue into career stuff at some point. I think you do, and I had a little way to do that. If you
go ahead.
There's a line in this play where it's called Bata, who's 72 and about to kill himself, and a woman described as in her late 70s, and the woman says, "First, I tried to imagine all the awful things that could happen, hoping that by picturing them, I would prevent them from taking place, since real life never happens like we envision it will. Finally, after an hour of this, I decided to sleep." And that's, I mean, first of all, do you think that's generally true? And secondly, if you think it's true that once we envision it, it can't happen, that's such an interesting position for someone in the theater to be in.
I mean, it is sort of that philosophy is sort of the power of negative thinking. I mean, it's the idea that if you imagine something, it doesn't happen. And I think, I guess I would, I mean, I was 22 when I wrote it, but I would probably agree that, look, real life, it is highly unlikely that whatever we imagine, that is exactly what comes to pass. Which is not to say that we can't imagine something which generally comes to pass, but not most likely in the way that we envision it. So that has an interesting implication for being a theater maker.
With many students who are very busy envisioning their lives.
Right, there's that. I mean, I feel at the same time that I've always been, I'm relatively positive about the future and about hoping that that things will happen, that good things will happen. But there's something about, I would say you imagine what it is that you want to be, but you're never going to actually get the specifics right. That you may get to be that person, but it's going to be different than what you imagined. And I think that's a fair statement.
I think so, too.
I like that through the character of Marcus in your Yellowface, who finds he's a character who finds himself by assuming an Asian identity, and he's white as they come, and he's wonderfully happy when he's an Asian American. He's found a community. He's found his community. Mm-hmm. Right. It's not that what he imagined.
Right.
But it's infinitely fulfilling.
Yeah. I mean, Marcus is a fun character because he becomes sort of DHH's nemesis in the play, and kind of the realization of the opposite of everything the DHH is claiming. So he's fun in that regard.
He's a lovely character. I was wondering about your East Coast, West Coast connections. You live in Southern California.
I live in Brooklyn.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I thought you were still in Southern California.
No, I haven't lived in California since the early 90s. So.
Oh, okay. So you've really become an East Coaster.
Yeah, I think I'm a New Yorker now.
That's great. I was going to ask you if you felt the East and the West Coast communities were different in theatrically, but I guess you've left.
I mean, I think I can still say I think they are different. We're talking about the theatrical communities. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in order to do theater in LA, you have to, I think, relish the notion of being an outsider, because you are doing theater in a city which is really all about something other than theater, about another way to tell stories and another form of script writing. So I feel like there are some people who thrive on that, and if on the other hand, doing theater in New York, I've always liked, because I like being part of a community of artists here, and that there are a lot of theater people and there's a lot of shows to see. And I also like just the ecology of the commercial theater. I mean, the commercial theater is, sort of horrible in a lot of ways, but I like the fact that New York is the only place in America where you can do theater and not just be doing art. That there's a kind of a commercial side to it here. And I like showbiz.
That's fabulous. Do you think that your theater practice has changed a lot from when you wrote M. Butterfly to now? I mean, I've read most of your plays and thought about your own evolution in terms of form, in terms of the themes you're preoccupied with. Do you really see yourself moving somewhere?
I don't know. I mean, when I think about the years since M. Butterfly, I'm mostly conscious of the fact that I had a 10-year gap when I didn't write a new full-length play, original play. I mean, I wrote a lot of other stuff. I wrote musicals and I wrote movies and operas and things, but I sort of didn't write plays, and that was between Golden Child in 1998 and Yellowface in 2007. And on some level, I feel like what I was struggling with during that whole period was trying to reconcile what happened during the Miss Saigon controversy. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that, in 1991, the Broadway musical Miss Saigon came from the West End to New York, and the Welsh actor Jonathan Pryce was cast as the Eurasian character of the engineer. And there were a lot of us who felt that this was an example of quote-unquote yellowface casting. And protested that, and it became a big kind of culture wars incident, which it only lasted about a week, but it was kind of an intense week, and I think I found that whole experience kind of scary, because it startled me the degree to which people kind of ran to their respective political positions and corners, and the idea of the concept of what it means to play a race, what it means to cross-cast, which is actually kind of very interesting and nuanced. There was really no opportunity to discuss this, certainly not in the media, that turned it into a media smackdown very quickly. But even with other people in the field, because the field got so charged up about it and so angry very quickly. And it just made me go, well, how do we talk about this afterward that Jeffrey Gregory read, that it's like, how are we going to get past that? How are we going to get past all this kind of anger that we have at one another, and how easily we get defensive? And so I wrote a play, Face Value, about it, which was a huge flop. It closed in previews on Broadway, and one of the headlines of the reviews in Boston was M. Turkey. which is funny now. But I feel like I then struggled with this for the next 10 years until kind of finally resolving it with Yellowface. And since then, I feel maybe I tend to write more comically than I did early in my career. But other than that, I feel like I'm kind of going along the same track I was, maybe with a bit more of an internationalist bent.
Yeah. I thought that Yellowface was astonishing for the way you used humor to kind of diffuse some of that vast polarization that had erupted around the Miss Saigon thing. Do you think that we are moving at all beyond hyper-consciousness about race and color in this culture, or is that just a post-race fantasy?
You mean is it a fantasy of post-racialism?
Yeah, yes.
I mean, no. Well, it depends kind of what time period you measure.
Yep.
I feel like, if you measure the last 5 years, I know there's been a lot of progress. If you measure the last 20 years, there's been a lot of progress. So it kind of depends, what you're trying to measure. But certainly at the moment, on the specific issues or the specific manifestation of racial consciousness, which Yellowface is talking about, i.e. the use of yellowface, the use of Caucasian actors playing Asians, there's this resurgence of yellowface that's happened over the last year or so, between the Orphan of Zhao controversy at the Royal Shakespeare Company and the Nightingale at La Jolla Playhouse. So there's somehow Yellowface has gotten back into or people just aren't thinking about it anymore and deciding that it's an okay thing to do. So in that respect, I would argue, no, we haven't really made that much progress since 1991.
And has your position stayed the same? Do you think that casting Caucasian actors in Asian roles is always a bad thing?
I feel like you have to parse it into the employment issue and the aesthetic issue. Okay. And I think the employment issue is fairly straightforward, which is, according to the recent statistics of the 2011-2012 season released by APAC about a week ago, in the Broadway theaters and the 12 major not-for-profits, of all the roles that were cast, only 20% were cast with any sort of minority. So, that's not a sustainable statistic for any field. You go the way of the Republican Party. So in terms of expanding the playing or leveling the playing field and expanding opportunities for minority actors, that's a pretty consistent position. That's why you go, okay, well, it's okay for minority actors to play parts that are considered white, but it's not okay for white actors to play minorities. Because you're trying to get that 20% larger. Now, if you get into the aesthetics of it, then like all aesthetic issues, it becomes more subjective and to some extent more interesting. I feel, for instance, that like Kui Gien's play, Agent G, a couple seasons ago, Kui wrote an autobiographical character and cast an African-American actor as himself. And then he kind of critiqued that choice within the play, which I thought was kind of fun and interesting and smart. There's the current production of Good Woman of Sichuan with Taylor Mack in the lead, which I think is, one could argue on the one hand feels like Nightingale, but on the other hand, you can go, well, that's kind of like taking Hamlet. And because other than that in the production, besides the names, there's not kind of a whiff of Orientalism or the sense that it is set in Asia in the production itself. So it's kind of like doing Hamlet and setting it in, say, Bali, and everybody's Balinese, but they're still talking about Denmark. So and that's an interesting debate. So I think once you get into the aesthetics, there are all sorts of things you can debate, but the employment issue feels fairly straightforward to me.
Okay, Gregory, do you want to pick up?
I have a million questions, but I'm sure so do these good people. Right. So,
is it okay if we go to the audience? Great. And do you want somebody to monitor, to field the questions? Is there a mic?
It doesn't matter unless you're taping. Good.
Shout it out.
So
Okay.
Could you tell us a little bit about your collaboration with Playwright?
Okay. Especially in the Q&A thing, I really like to be able to see everybody. So I'm just going to sit on like the back of my chair just to improve the sight lines. Philip first asked me to work with him when he was about my age, and I was in my late 20s, and I think he'd seen some of my early work at the Public and really liked it. And he initially approached me about working on an adaptation of War of the Worlds, which actually I can't find a good place to sit. One sec. Okay, this is better. And then we found that the rights were controlled by the Electric Light Orchestra, which is a fun fact. And so then we decided to do our own piece about alien abductions when it was still a relatively obscure subject and sort of long before the X-Files. But Philip is really, he's really easy to work with. He usually has an idea for something. He comes to me about every 10 years and wants to do something. And then we kind of come up with the treatment or the story outlined together. I go away and I write my part of it, and he'll maybe have a few notes, but generally, in my experience, tends to work from the position that the collaborator in a particular field knows more about that field than he does. It's just very easy. He's very pleasant. I'm sorry, I don't have it. Do you have anything more specific you want to ask? Oh, we did 4. We did this piece, 1,000 Airplanes on the Roof, which is really kind of a musical theater piece. It's a monologue. Okay. And then a proper opera, a grand opera at the Met in '92 called The Voyage, which was sort of then he adapted these 2 one-acts, House of Sleeping Beauties and Sound of a Voice, into chamber operas for the American Repertory Theater in the around 2005, maybe. And then we just did a piece a couple of years ago, which was an adaptation of the Columbia theoretical physicist Brian Greene's book, Icarus at the Edge of Time. So those are 4 collaborations.
On the subject that you were just addressing as far as cross-casting, yellowface, and the issue of minorities not being as well represented in casting of shows, especially here in New York, what would you say about young people, we'll confine it to Asian American, young Asian Americans getting into theater? Because growing up, I was in theater all through school, and there were very few Asian American children, even though it was a very large Asian American community where I grew up. Very few of them wanted to do theater, though. Mm-hmm. And is there an enticement for that particular community to become part of a theater community, to want to pursue this particular art form? And in relation to that also, do you think there's kind of a catch-22 in that there do seem to be so few roles being taken by or being performed by Asian Americans, and so young people watch movies or watch TV shows or even go see theater, and they don't see very many Asian Americans, and so they therefore do not want to be part of that.
Right. In terms of Asian Americans going into the theater, it's not to make a broad cultural generalization, but oftentimes Asian American parents who are immigrants do not want their kids to go into the theater. And part of that has to do with the degree to which it's not a particularly respected field traditionally in China, certainly. But another part of it is just that kind of immigrant striving and feeling that immigrants want their kids to go into some field that seems more financially stable. Personally, I would argue that there is no such thing as a financially stable field, so you might as well do what you want, and you're more likely to be successful at it if you love what you're doing. In terms of this sort of catch-22, Yeah, I mean, it's certainly discouraging that Asian Americans grow up and you don't see too many people who look like you on our small screens and large screens. But that's part of what it means to be an American and to decide to do something that's going to change the culture. And there's certainly a history of African Americans having also being relatively invisible and being able to find a place. And I feel pretty confident that this situation is going to improve. It has certainly improved over the last 20 years. And if you take the long view, I think it has to improve over the next 20, because of demographics, because this country is changing and there's simply product to be sold, and people and these companies want to appeal to the widest range of consumers possible. And B, the rising influence of Asia, and in particular China and India, means that particularly in film, where major Hollywood studios now, who more than half of their revenue comes from overseas, this sometimes may provide more opportunity for overseas Asians than for Asian Americans, but I think we